Hello, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. This sounds wonderful. I'm totally a captive of narrative and in the history business of which I am tangentially involved in because I am first and foremost a filmmaker. Narrative has not always been in fashion. After the Second World War, with its unbelievable deaths and atomic age, they turned to other interpretations of Freudian and symbolism and Marxist economic stuff and all sorts of different ways in, and found out that the quickest way in, the one that could carry the biggest load of all of the diversity of those perspectives, was narrative. Just and then, and then, and then.
And when we were talking earlier, and I mentioned that we use photos here, and the power of one single moment in time to evoke our imaginations, to bring us together and yet separate in which way we'll go. Can you talk about when you first realized that a still photo could be turned into a film?
Well, the backup of that is that my father was a cultural anthropologist, but an amateur and very avid still photographer. So my very first memory at 2.5 is of him building a dark room in the basement of a tract house in a development in Newark, Delaware. And a couple seconds later, I have a little film clip of him holding me in his left arm while the right arm was manipulating in that eerie red light, the alchemy of watching a picture come up. So the power of imagery is great. When I saw my mom was sick with cancer and died 10 years later when I was 11, almost 12, and I never saw my dad cry until he was sharing with me an old movie. And he burst into tears. And at that moment, at age 12, I knew that I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I ended up going to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, a new, brand new, just opened experimental college, still there, still experimenting, still wonderful, in which all the still photographers were not the Hollywood directors I thought that I would become, but social documentary still photographers and filmmakers who reminded me that the drama of what is and what was is as important as anything the human imagination dreams of. And a lot of that had to do with understanding that earlier idea that there is in a single image the power. And I'm sure all of you engaged in writing have used a still photograph as a kind of stepping stone, a way to try to investigate, to talk, to describe the activity of it. The cliche is it's worth 1,000 words. I think, today in our society where it's so easy to do it that maybe it's been devalued to 500 or 250, but we're looking in our work to find full value out of those photographs, in some cases tens of thousands of photographs that we look at and film, rephotograph, and the thousands that we use in our film. But I want to say, as I told you earlier, that the word is not the enemy of that. It is, in fact, a partner. And in the beginning for us becomes the word. We never start editing until we're done with a few, what we call blind assemblies, where we're just listening to the narration read by me, written by, some really great writers that I've worked with, had the great privilege to work with over the last 50 years, and the talking heads, if they're there, all cut up. But when that moment when we feel like we've wrestled the main shape of the narrative to the ground, that's when we begin to add pictures. And
Mm.
it's not to say that the pictures have not animated things that we've written. They have. We don't go out with a script trying to illustrate, you know, a line in on page 7 of episode 3. Um, we are always writing what we want, unconcerned with whether they're images to illustrate, and filming those images we're drawn to visually without a concern that it's going to fit in a particular scene. It requires a lot of horse trading and editing, but it keeps each of those entities, those very powerful entities, pure and undiluted and able to express a pure form. So instead of illustrating, we're looking for what the great photographer Paul Strand called equivalence. And
Mm.
everybody here knows exactly what I'm talking about in equivalence. You don't have to show Lincoln, whose birthday it is today, when you're talking about him. You can go and look at the dead at Gettysburg. You can look at his humble beginnings. You can see an artifact. You are liberated when the narrative is under your control to do those things.
Mm. Magnificent. So here's one of the things I wonder about. Your work is so vast, it's so honest and real, and we've all learned a lot more about the truth as a result, and I appreciate that so much.
Thank you.
So, and I know you're doing constantly so many projects at the same time.
Oh, it's just because I'm greedy. You know, there's nothing better. As everyone knows, writing, it's a tough discipline. Filmmaking is super, super hard. It's collaborative, but just knowing that you've made a film better, submitting to the process it's such a drug, that you just, I'm getting older. I'm 70. I need to have all this stuff. I'm going to run out of time. If I were given 1,000 years to live, I wouldn't run out of topics in American history. And I am not, Sherry, going to be given 1,000 years to live. So there's lots of work to do.
Well, I'm sure your work will last thousands of years. But how do you handle all the stress of the business, of the work, of travel, of so many different things simultaneously?
Yeah, somebody asked me about 20 years ago why I look so young. And I said excessive worry and travel. That is like literally
Mm,
what it is. And working in public television, you have to reinvent the wheel every time. I just can't go into a streaming service or a premium cable and say, here's my 10-year plan. Will you fund it all? They might, and that would save me a lot of trouble, but we're raising money. The process is really sustaining. And if you trust the process, then it's really just a day-to-day, moment-to-moment thing in which you try to bring the best of yourselves. And if you feel good at the end of the day, you wake up, you can say, who was the idiot who suggested that? And then try to figure out a new solution. But, you know, these are big tasks that we've set for ourselves, and they require a kind of humility. And while it is very stressful and the money part is important, there's actually an economy of scale, not just financially to doing more than one at once, but also kind of spiritually. That if you can work on, I just finished a film day before yesterday, meaning we locked the picture, not day before yesterday, on Thursday, we locked the picture, um, meaning there's no more film editing. We've now got sound editing and mixing and onlining before it's broadcast. And the first non-American topic on Leonardo.
mm,
And there was something so exciting. And then what happened is that I could then go back to several other projects and see them new because I had focused so intently on the last push, the last few weeks of concentrating on Leonardo. And so, all of the things, look, here's the thing, and I think it's true, and maybe every great writer would say that we write the same thing over and over again,
mm.
right? It's just practice.
So when you get frustrated, do you walk away and then go work on something else?
No, you know what? You try to, you don't have the luxury in a collaborative meeting. I think in an individual thing, and that part of the work that I do that's individual, yeah, you can sort of step away from that crossword puzzle and come back to it later and see it in a different light. But when it's collaborative, you just actually have to do it. And we don't yell. Nobody yells. We might have in a Zoom like this, we might have, 20 people on the Zoom working, or in person downstairs in this barn or down the road a mile and a half at our editing house. But you have to figure it out. And sometimes, a day of editing you'll spend 2 hours on a paragraph, and then all of a sudden you manage to do 10 pages for the rest of the day, or you do 30 pages. It just, you have to sit in it, and it talks to you. And after, when you put an image and an image together, just like a word and a word together, you now have at least a third thing.
Mm,
And if each of those pictures are 1,000 words, then you're dealing with kind of exponential complexity. And if you've done a series, say, on Vietnam that's 18 hours long and maybe has, 400 or 500 images an episode, which 2 hours episode, you're dealing with such astronomical combinations
mm,
that you have only one posture. And that's similar to what happens when you walk out and see a night sky,
mm.
you know?
So your
And
posture
try
is
to
awe.
is awe, humility. There was somebody, I made a film on the national parks, and I came across a guy who in 1916 had traveled up to Alaska, what was then called Mount McKinley, now is called Mount Denali. It's the highest mountain in North America. And he said it reminded him of his atomic insignificance.
Wow.
And I love that, his
Wow.
atomic insignificance. But just think about it. That act of submitting inspirits you, makes you larger, just as the egotist in our midst is diminished by his or her self regard. There's a
Mm,
funny kind of paradoxical power and truth to that kind of humility or submission. And so we spend as much time as we can listening to the story tell us, and we don't make films about stuff we know about. We make films about things we want to know about.
Mm,
And so we're open to scholars, we're open to ordinary people who say, I don't understand that, warm bodies, we call them. We're open to colleagues, we're, so that there's not just I mean, the buck stops here. The final decision is mine, but I would be an idiot if I impose that in any kind of dictatorial spirit. And that, that goes true when you're writing, because you've got a crowd of me, myself, and I, and all the thousands of variations of yourself that you're arguing with and you're thinking about and are contradicting you and are not sure and doubtful and are positive and arrogant. I said to somebody yesterday on a Sunday, that people think that the opposite of faith is doubt. Actually, doubt is central to faith.
mm,
Faith
mm,
is not a living, breathing thing unless there's doubt. The
mm.
opposite of faith is certainty. That's death.
That's the opposite of realizing that you're just one little atom.
Yeah,
And so we have this push-pull with our humility and our hunger.
yeah.
And so when you talk about nobody yells in your meetings, well, duh. I mean, everyone is working under your energy, your vision, and you are so even keeled. I wonder, you shared that your mom died when you were so young. How did that impact you and your drive?
Uh, everything. I mean, I wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be talking to me if that happened. She got cancer when I was 1.5, 2. She died just, as I said, before my 12th birthday. There was never a moment when I wasn't aware growing up. I didn't have a childhood. Movies were a way in which, following my father's, that it had provided. I'd never seen him cry before. And all of a sudden he was crying, and I realized they provided an emotional safe haven. And that was something to think about. And that meant being Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford or Howard Hawks in the mid 60s. But, many years later, I was describing to my late father-in-law, who was an eminent psychologist. I said, the day she died, April 28th, 1965, is always approaching and always receding. I've never been present at the day. And he looked at me.
Mm,
He goes, yep. And I bet you blew out your candles as a kid, wishing she'd come back. And I go, how do you know? And then he listed off 3 or 4 other things that I did secretly and privately, and no one knew this, and he knew it already. And
it's
he
also,
said, this is the magical thinking of an 11-year-old. You're keeping your mother alive. And what do you think you do for a living? And I said, excuse me?
mm,
He said, you wake the dead. You
mm,
make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? So
mm.
so that, I can hide behind the fact it's not dime store psychology because he was an eminent psychologist. But I can take that kind of easy, condensed, and just tell you that it's got a really happy ending. That my oldest daughter, now 41, 13 years ago, last month, had a daughter. My mother's name was Lila, Lyla,
Mm,
a 19th century version of it. And she named her first child after a woman she never met. And so the word Lila was never spoken. My brother and I, the survivors of this horrific tragedy, say mommy still. She
mm.
seems much taller than us, than our father, who shrunk as he got older, as we not towered, but grew above him. And she stays that. But the word Lila still was draped in black crepe until January 18th, 2011, when we now say it
The word.
all the time. And I've never, since that moment, speaking to my father-in-law, missed April 28th.
Wow. That's just
So
incredible.
I'm just, if I ever had time to write, a kind of memoir or whatever you'd call it, it would be called Waking the Dead.
Wow. Unbelievable. What an example of how our anguish and tragedy force us.
All of us, everyone here, we like good times. We try to design our life. We think a pursuit of happiness means stuff and easy sailing, and it doesn't. It means lifelong learning. That's what our founders meant by happiness. Happiness was being able to pursue constant education. But all of us are more defined by the tragedies and those things than we are by the smooth sailing. And that's really a test of who we are in our character, and our writing or our work. Our creativity comes out of the fact that, first and foremost, everyone within the sound of my voice, no one is getting out of here alive.
Yeah.
None of us. There will not be an exception made in your case, and you will live forever. Period. Full stop.
Yep.
That's it. And so we could, as human beings, be wrapped in a fetal position because that's sort of a sad thing, but we don't. We write symphonies, we tend gardens, we raise children. This is what it is. It's all just Wynton Marsalis said in jazz, it's keeping the wolf in my film on jazz, keeping the wolf from the door.
Mm,
That wolf is the intimation of mortality.
mm. I love that. And also, when you say that someone can recognize what your fantasy was as a child, I think that we all go through these same things.
Yes, of
And
course.
it's not hard to fathom what someone else is feeling. So one reason that we meet in groups to do this work is just to show that
We need each other. We need each other. I have made films for more than 50 years about the US, but I also realize that I've also made films about us.
mm,
That is to say, the lowercase two-letter plural pronoun. All of the intimacy of us and we and our, and all of the majesty, the complexity, the contradiction, and even the controversy of the US. And I have been able to exist in that space between those two things, just as the architecture of the solar system resembles the architecture of the atom, as above, so below, some religious teachings say. We have that opportunity and we cannot do it alone. We have to recognize and be recognized. And it occurs in circumstances like this.
absolutely. And that's the reason we have this crisis of connection, this horrible loneliness
Yep.
that was not ushered in by the pandemic. We have
No.
had this for a long
Social
time.
social media isn't, right?
Yeah.
Social
And
media isn't. And it doesn't mean that just you walk down the street in New York and everybody's on something, or you go into a room and everybody's on their devices. That's the kind of physical manifestation of it. But it's the social part isn't happening. It's a dynamic of isolation, and it breeds loneliness rather than what together we're all dying alone, no matter what we think. Um, that what we do in community, what we do together with each other is a nurturing, incredibly positive thing that we do, which is the opposite of all of that other stuff. It transforms loneliness into solitude, and solitude is a creative force.
absolutely. We turn our pain into creativity and you get something for it. Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here and sharing what you have shared. I know your time is tight and you have to go, but I just wanted to thank you and see if you will give us one more little thing.
Well, I think I quoted to you earlier. Today is Lincoln's birthday, so my favorite speech of his is not the Gettysburg Address, which is really good, or the first inauguration when he calls for the better angels of our nation, or the second Malice toward none. It's early when he was a young lawyer in Springfield and asked to address the Young Men's Lyceum, right? We have women here too, thankfully. Um, and the topic for that day, I think it was a luncheon, was foreign policy. And he said, "Whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic giant step the earth and crush us at a blow?" And then he answered his own question. No, all the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track in the Blue Ridge in the trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live through all time or die by suicide.
Mm,
It's chilling. He presided over the closest we've ever come yet to national suicide, which was the Civil War. But there's a kind of positivity in that, two oceans separating us, two relatively benign neighbors, and it's allowed us to incubate some really great things. Unfortunately, it's allowed us to incubate some really bad things as well.
yeah.
The love of money, the greed that comes from that, the separation between people based on classes, obviously all the differences of othering. There's no us, there's only us, there's no them. And we see this all the time. And now we're in the greatest crisis, much more than the Civil War. And you realize that the possibility of dying by suicide is evident because of these things that we are dangerously incubating in this country. The most important, which is a kind of lack of communication, as you suggested, with each other. So we just need to connect. There's no them, there's only us.
Thank you so much. And please continue your work, run for president.
I already have the
You'll
best
make
job in the
films.
country.
Uh, your words are a gift. I so appreciate your presence. Thank you for being here and sharing yourself.
Thank you. It's great. I'm just going to hop back and go back into the editing room right now. But I've really enjoyed being with you. Thank you so much for
Thank you
having.
so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.